A very interesting 2020 book titled If Then, How the Simatics Corporation Invented the Future by Jill Lepore is about the Simatics Corporation, which was founded in 1959 in New York City. It offered a product called People Machine for election campaigns, comparable to what Cambridge Analytica did for the Trump campaign in 2016. The trail leads to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge on the work of the political scientist Ethel de la Sola Poole. He helped found Simatics Corporation and led the Cold War era campaign to bring behavioral science to the defense industry, election campaigns, and commerce. Simatics insisted it had put John F. Kennedy into the White House by a razor-thin margin. People Machine worked according to the if-then principle. When A happens, B happens. Today we're getting used to software like Palantir telling the police where crimes are most likely to happen, or Google knowing exactly what personality structure you have. Back then, software and computers were either completely foreign to most people, or they had only ever seen huge computing machines in a company, a university, on television, or at a government agency. If the People Machine was to be further developed, the researchers said it could be used to predict human behavior, whether it is buying a particular washing machine, voting for a particular candidate, or taking part in revolutionary uprisings. The company inspired a number of science fiction novels and films, such as Rainer Werner Fassbinder's World on a Wire, which in turn acted as an inspiration for the later film The Matrix from 1999. The plot of World on a Wire takes place in an alternative reality set in the 1970s. At the Institute for Cybernetics and Future Research, a supercomputer called Simulacron-1 was developed that is capable of simulating a small town. The simulation runs around the clock and is populated by identity units that lead roughly the same lives as normal living people and have consciousness. Except for a single contact unit, none of the simulated people know that their world is a simulation or simulacrum. You can connect to the illusory world with a contact circuit, and there are simulated people within the illusory world who want to escape into reality. The people at the Research Institute soon begin to wonder whether they themselves and their surroundings are perhaps just a simulation. In 1952, the two American parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were so similar that voters cared more about presidential candidates than political positions. Marketing, television, and left versus right propaganda increasingly played an important role. In today's situation, TV and the internet dictate pretty much everything, and the two parties accuse each other of completely betraying America and democracy. In 1952, during the presidential election, audiences first saw the UNIVAC computer, which appeared to be able to predict the election results. A group of leading scientists were recruited around the idea of developing even better methods to simulate human behavior. For example, Eugene Burdick, a psychologist in a new field of behavioral science from Stanford University, who served in World War II, continued his studies at Oxford University on a scholarship as a Rhodes Scholar, a protege of the Anglo-American wealth empire. The British and American armed forces ran very successful in secret psychological warfare programs during the Second World War, which aroused interest in ever new advances that required a number of civilian researchers who were not allowed to know that it was about psychological warfare, but rather worked in civil-sounding fields such as marketing, communications research, or behavioral research. It was a manageable case of leading scientists who worked, for example, at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, which was created by the Ford Foundation in 1954. And we had Harold Dwight Laswell, one of the founders of Simatics. He was a leading American political scientist and communications theorist. He was a graduate student at the University of Chicago and a professor of law at Yale University. He is known for his communication model that focuses on who says what to whom in which channel with what effect. He is also known for his book on pathological psychological characteristics of leaders in politics and business, called Psychopathology in Politics, as well as another book on politics. It reads like the blueprint for the world we live in today, with Facebook and algorithms and tailored election campaign advertising for even the smallest possible groups. Then we had Ethel de Sola Poole. He was an outstanding researcher with ties to the US Department of Defense. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Poole's later work with Simatics Corporation included contracts with the Department of Defense to predict insurgencies in Vietnam. He was also involved in Simatics' effort to predict where race riots would occur in the United States. Daniel Ellsberg would later say of Poole, "I considered him without question the most corrupt social scientist I had ever met." At first he was denied access to secret material because he was suspected of being a secret communist. Later, students at MIT protested against him for his involvement in a computerized counterinsurgency program in the United States. The think tank RAND wanted Poole for an ultra-secret group led by the National Security Council. His ancestors were rabbis and dated back to the Middle Ages in Spain. His father had communist connections, worked in New York, and received a doctorate from the German Welf University of Heidelberg. Then we had Project Troy. That was a research study on psychological warfare conducted for the State Department in the fall of 1950 by a group of scientists, including physicists, historians, and psychologists from Harvard University, the MIT, and the RAND Corporation. The Troy report to the Secretary of State presented to Dean Acheson on February 1st, 1951 contained various political warfare suggestions, including possible methods for minimizing the impact of Soviet jammers on Voice of America broadcasts. During World War II, the United States War Information Office launched a large-scale information and propaganda campaign at home and abroad through the radio broadcasts, newspapers, posters, photographs, films, and other media, but psychological warfare operations were carried out by military special forces. The purpose was to break the Stalinist system by increasing the number of input points in the system and creating complex and unpredictable situations that required action. In principle, Soviet citizens were informed about the harsh truth of the regime. The techniques used are similar to those used to deprogram members of a cult. One of Troy's key researchers was Max Millikan, who earned a physics degree from Yale University. In 1935 and until 1936, he was a student at Cambridge University. Back at Yale in 1941, he received his doctorate in economics. In 1946, he joined the US State Department as chief economist in the Intelligence Bureau's Research Division for Europe. In 1947, he served on the President's Commission on Foreign Aid as Assistant Executive Secretary and was Counselor to the United States House of Representatives. In 1949, he returned to academia, to the MIT, where he was appointed Associate Professor. In 1951 to 1952, he took a year's leave to serve as Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then we had Edward Geary Lansdale. He was an officer in the United States Air Force until he retired as a Major General in 1963, before continuing his work at the CIA. Lansdale was a pioneer in clandestine operations and psychological warfare. In the early 1950s, Lansdale played a significant role in the suppression of the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines. In 1954, he moved to Saigon and began the Saigon Military Mission, a covert intelligence operation created to sow discord in North Vietnam. Lansdale believed that the United States could win guerrilla wars by studying the psychology of the enemy, an approach that won the approval of the Kennedy and Johnson presidential administrations. The behavioral science and psychological warfare experts were allowed to work with the latest computers, such as the IBM 704, and used a programming language called Fortran. It is considered the first high-level programming language ever actually implemented. The 704 was considered pretty much the only computer that could handle complex mathematics at the time. Neither the technology nor the programming language was sophisticated enough to simply answer complex questions about human behavior. You had to prepare your tasks step by step, break them down into individual parts, and experiment. It took a while to get the IBM 704 to play chess reasonably well. For example, social networks were researched, which did not mean something like Facebook in the internet era, but rather the relationships between individual people in the real world. Who does John Doe know very closely, and whom does he know casually? Is his father a Republican voter? Does he have a close, positive relationship with his father? How does this affect the risk perception? Does he like new and fashionable things? Such networks can be used to decide how a successful advertising campaign for a political candidate should be designed and whether the person is susceptible to socialist propaganda. Hired first by the US Democratic Party National Committee in 1959 and then by the John F. Kennedy campaign in 1960, simatics pioneered the use of computer simulation, pattern recognition, and prediction in American political campaigns. You could divide the entire population into 480 categories. Certain opinions were also categorized. The difference to today is that it is now possible to differentiate much more precisely, and more data is available because people are constantly using the internet. In addition to Poole, there were researchers from MIT, Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and Columbia University in New York City. Alex Bernstein from IBM was also part of the group. John F. Kennedy won the 1960 US presidential election by the narrowest vote margin since the 1880s, 49.7% to Richard Nixon's 49.5%. On election night, an IBM 7090 computer calculated that Kennedy would win based on early, relatively small amounts of data. You can see an IBM 7090 in the film Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick, where a crazed anti-communist US officer triggers the Doomsday Machine, an automated mechanism that manages a nuclear war without human input. Before Kennedy's inauguration, a storm broke out when Harper's Magazine published a shocking story. A top-secret computer called the People Machine, invented by mysterious men, had actually put Kennedy in office. Back then, the possibilities of psychometrics were not as great as they are today, but the technological revolution was taking place. In 1963, simatics, commissioned by the Kennedy administration, simulated Venezuela's entire economy to halt the advance of socialism and communism. A larger project to carry out such work across Latin America, mostly designed by Poole and known as Project Camelot, became so controversial that the next president, Lyndon B. Johnson, disbanded it. After 1965, simatics conducted psychological research in Vietnam as part of a larger project to use computers to predict revolutions. Simatics used counterinsurgency tools in 1967 and 68 when protests against racial injustice erupted on the streets of US cities such as Los Angeles, California, and Detroit, Michigan. Why was a company listed on the stock market run by private entrepreneurs allowed to carry out such delicate tasks? Because the scientists involved were embedded in the military-industrial complex. Every significant uprising in the world, every war and every significant election could be analyzed retrospectively and compared with any existing computer predictions in order to train and improve the calculation models and algorithms. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces used IBM technology combined with a form of psychometrics for the bombing campaign against the Third Reich. Not only was it precisely managed where and how much was bombed, but also how this changed the morale of the German population. Psychologists evaluated information from the secret services, which prepared reports on the Germans' willingness to continue supporting the war. The author of Science of Coercion knows that psychological warfare is hidden behind scientific fields such as communication research and provides tons of names of researchers, institutions, and programs. You can find out things from all sorts of openly accessible sources. This was the price that the US paid for enabling greater levels of freedom. It's better to literally flood people with bad books, shows, and podcasts. People then have a feeling of freedom and the feeling that they have already achieved something through their media consumption. Certain works are made into bestsellers, whereupon imitators copy exactly this content. Finding real quality is becoming more and more like looking for a needle in a haystack. Paul Lazarsfeld, Office of Applied Social Research at Columbia University, for example, popularized the idea of narcotic media dysfunction, a theory that suggests that to the extent that the media floods people with a particular issue, people become apathetic toward it. People choose consumption and opinions in place of action. This would lead to actual physical social action being neglected. The more time is spent learning about current issues, the less time is available for organized actions. However, being informed and concerned is not a substitute for action. The basic misconception is, I have an opinion, so I did something. Although there is an increasing number of political messages, information and advertising through traditional and online media, genuine political participation continues to decline. People pay a lot of attention to the media, but there's an overstimulation of messages that are often confusing and contradictory. You need information that saves you time, saves you from making mistakes, increases your control and your ability to act. Information must be able to improve your actions. Counterintelligence must become a common skill. Otherwise, media is more like a problem. By saturating people with information, the media can breed ignorance, indifference, and forgetfulness. After the death of George Floyd at the hands of 4 police officers, there was a flood of media reports, expressions of sympathy, analysis, comments, and other forms of activism, but it was clear from the outset that nothing will change in the general situation. Neo-Nazis have been agitating for 75 years and conspiracy media has existed for 200 years without having had any significant positive effect. Hadley Cantrell's Institute for International Social Research at Princeton made important contributions to propaganda psychology, to study public opinion, to apply psychology and psychological research to national policy, international understanding and communication, on developmental psychology, on the psychology of social movements for measurement and scaling, to humanistic psychology, on the psychology of perception, and, fundamental to all of them, to the analysis of human behavior from a transactional standpoint. Cantrell's program at Princeton expanded in September 1940 when Nelson Rockefeller, FDR's coordinator for Inter-American Affairs, asked the Princeton psychologists to establish mechanisms which would measure public opinion in Latin America. In 1955, together with Lloyd Free, he founded the Institute for International Social Research. The IISR was frequently asked by United States government agencies to conduct small samples of opinion polls abroad. In particular, Cantrell led and Free conducted a poll in Cuba in 1960 that showed strong support for Fidel Castro, which was overlooked during the presidential transition between Eisenhower and Kennedy, and only read after the Bay of Pigs invasion fiasco. When the CIA abroad or the FBI at home planned an operation during the 1950s, the relevant profiles of the target persons, including an assessment of their personality structures, could be created with relatively little effort. The better the profile, the easier it was to determine which methods to successfully recruit the target person as a source, or to sabotage or intimidate them. If it was a larger operation against a group, it was no longer enough to create individual target profiles, but rather one had to assess how the group functions as an organism. Then the US political leadership demanded that the CIA overthrow governments in countries like Iran so that millions of different citizens there could be given new governments. What kind of target profile should you create for an entire country? How did the Iranians think and feel? Was it possible to gather enough people to overthrow the current government? What were the chances of success in the phase immediately after the fall of the old regime? Will the new order soon collapse again? Is it possible to win the support of the rural population, the wealthier and more educated city dwellers, and the privileged upper class? The best scientists were recruited, many of whom had already dominated the field of psychological warfare during World War II. The new objective was much more than just designing tailor-made propaganda for planned regime changes, but rather ushering in a new era of computer calculations. The different population groups were thoroughly studied and measured for hundreds of factors, such as trust in institutions, cultural values, paranoia, hostility towards outsiders, attitudes towards change, etc. Using a software program, coups could be digitally rehearsed using various variables until the result was satisfactory and could be implemented to some extent in reality. If needed metrics were not available in the target population, appropriate action could be taken in the real world to alter the values in preparation for regime change. The software was also used afterwards, when a new government was installed, to stabilize the situation and reduce threats. The CIA was repeatedly accused of acting wildly during the Cold War, of launching botched actions and only discussing successes. Pulitzer Prize-winning Tim Weiner is particularly harsh in his judgment in his book CIA: The Whole Story. He evaluated 50,000 files, most of them came from the intelligence world and the rest from the White House and the State Department. What he doesn't have on his radar is the fact that such large-scale operations were prepared for years by special, highly secret departments of scientists who researched the target country in every detail and understood the population there better than they understood themselves. Only after they were satisfied with their calculations did the CIA get the green light to put the plan into action. Of course, typical problems arose for the agents in the target country, which cannot be completely programmed into a computer simulation. The networks recruited by the CIA may have been infiltrated by adversaries. Agent may have been observed unnoticed despite security measures. People involved may communicate via unsecured channels for some reason or suddenly switch sides, or an important agent forgets important secret files in his hotel room. A journalist like Tim Weiner can of course study the declassified CIA files decades later and interpret the respective coup operation as a bungling, but firstly, the Secret Service often succeeded in achieving its intended goal, and secondly, Weiner does not understand the enormous preparatory work that was done by these scientist departments, because there is significantly less information about their work. His criticisms of moderately to poorly qualified CIA personnel and the alcoholism of senior officials do not concern scientists either. The 1960s saw many new civil movements, anti-war groups, and radical activism, with sympathies for the USSR and the supposed communist freedom fighters. The US upper class countered this primarily with moderate left-wing organizations, film propaganda by the US Information Agency, and novels such as George Orwell's 1984. Under the banner of national security, the CIA ran Operation Chaos to understand the phenomenon of radicalization and the many new socio-cultural trends. The criminal Charles Manson was observed by special doctors and given skills, whereupon he treated members of a small cult with LSD, the very drug that was being diligently experimented with in the CIA's MKUltra program. Manson's followers committed the grotesque Tate LaBianca murders, and afterwards the government had to cover up all the traces of the secret research. The journalist Tom O'Neill found secret correspondence in 200 old file boxes between the busy Dr. West and MKUltra leader Sidney Gottlieb. West had always denied taking part in MKUltra. Proposed projects included implanting false memories using drugs and hypnosis, inducing mental disorders, and altering a person's beliefs and morals. Someone like Manson could be viewed early on by the CIA researchers in San Francisco as a chance find for an experimental study. Likewise, researchers could also determine what type of person they were interested in and then search the databases for suitable candidates. It is also conceivable that long-term projects were carried out with children from broken backgrounds, youth homes for those who were difficult to educate, etc., which were observed over decades. The terrorist Theodore Kaczynski, who became known as the Unabomber, was studied at the university by Dr. Murray, who is said to have been involved with the MKUltra program. LSD may have also been involved. Kaczynski was highly intelligent and worked as a mathematician for a few years until he bought a lonely property with a small wooden cabin in Montana, lived like a hermit, and from there sent parcel bombs to people who represented technological progress. In 1995, he sent a manifesto to the media entitled Industrial Society and Its Future, which argued that the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a catastrophe for humanity. A 2018 New Yorker magazine article emphasizes that Kaczynski remains viewed by many within the green anarchist and eco-extremist movements as a prophetic figure to this day. In prison, the notorious mafia criminal James Whitey Bulger agreed to take part in medical research into the treatment of epilepsy, behind which the MKUltra program was hidden, and he was pumped full of LSD in exchange for a reduced sentence. There is suspicion that the CIA was well aware of Jim Jones's People's Temple cult, which fled from California to Guyana, where over 900 members drank poisoned soda and died. After some aspects of MKUltra were exposed, the government reacted as one would expect, declared the program small, a failure, and over, only to continue it under different names and better disguises. The knowledge gained from MKUltra or Chaos is still largely secret, and one has to assume that the computer models have been improved with it. If the developers of the software noticed that they were missing certain data about American citizens and important mechanisms, a corresponding research assignment could be formulated, which could then be passed on to other authorities and carried out. It is bizarre that only in 2023, major public concerns were expressed about artificial intelligence in the form of new chatbots, such as ChatGPT, which can be spoken to and write reports on command. The possibilities are almost unlimited. Individual activist groups can be mapped on the computer in order to clarify important questions for the profile, such as the expected further development of the organization in terms of influence and risk potential. You can experiment digitally to see what happens if the competence of the members and leadership increases. More members join, more money becomes available. What is the prospect of it connecting with similar groups? How can you exert influence so that the group remains isolated? If a computer simulation produces a worrying result, appropriate operations can be designed by ordinary human espionage to slow down the group. Parallel to projects such as Camelot and the increased use of computers and automated measurements of the personality structure of citizens, there was an increasing polarization in politics in the US with the left socialist and the right-wing conservative ideology. In the 1800s and even the first half of the 20th century, the two major parties in the US were not at all as ideologically positioned as they are today. In 1952, the Democrats and Republicans were so similar that voters cared more about presidential candidates and policy positions. Computer simulations can be constantly improved by new data flowing in and by refined mechanisms for representing human behavior. It's like optimizing a running engine. During his 2015-2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump was supported by the data company Cambridge Analytica, which attracted too much attention by boasting about its abilities, and by the Q movement, which is adamant that Trump was part of a secret team from influential patriotic circles that was about to arrest prominent Democrats and save America. More and more citizens were horrified to discover that their relatives had become complete fanatics, no longer amenable to logic and counter-arguments. In all likelihood, the movement was carefully observed and studied in order to identify which citizens with which personality profiles became radicalized and at what level of media consumption, to the point where they were willing to engage in risky and illegal acts and to isolate themselves from family and close friends. For years, there were radical videos on the YouTube video platform from areas such as right-wing extremism and classic conspiracy ideology. Social media such as Facebook were also a playground for activists, a goldmine of information to understand how users think and behave. After 1945, the US government sponsored more research at universities and was disguised as civilian with terms like opinion research and sociology. The Troy Project at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology led to the creation of the Center for International Studies, founded by the Ford Foundation and the CIA. One of Troy's key researchers was Max Millikan, who earned his physics degree from Yale University. In 1951-52, he served as deputy director of the CIA. The top-secret project Camelot began in 1964 at the Special Operations Research Office at American University in Washington, D.C., and was built internally as a study to develop methods to anticipate and influence potential uprisings, civil wars, and major societal changes. In many countries, the vast majority of people lived in poverty, were uneducated, and therefore vulnerable to communist propaganda. How would a farmer in Chile react to a charismatic communist or conservative revolutionary? What would make such a revolutionary particularly attractive? How strongly could this farmer be influenced by the church to reject communist ideas? What circumstances would he accept and remain passive? A number of civilian researchers had been recruited in such countries to find answers that could ultimately be fed into a computer program. However, a few professors in South America noticed the military funding and motives behind the research contracts, causing the US Department of Defense to officially declare Project Camelot over after just around a year. The progenitor of Project Camelot was the Smithsonian Group for Psychology and Social Sciences at the Smithsonian Institution, with staff from the RAND Corporation, the Psychological Corporation, General Electric, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Smithsonian itself, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as from top universities such as the University of Michigan, Vanderbilt, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and Northwestern. Princeton professor Harry Eckstein wrote about this in a report. Quote, "There is virtually no limit to the research that can and should be conducted on the topic of internal war." The Smithsonian Group's recommendations led to a wave of additional research programs. The scientists were supposed to do the preparatory work for the coups so that the CIA could then implement the plans. Brazil's populist president Goulart was overthrown on April 1st, 1964, shortly after promising the masses a program of land reform and industrial nationalization. In the Andes in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, multinational corporations interested in sugar, mining, and oil faced strong resistance from indigenous populations whose lands they sought to expropriate. This indigenous bloc had been targeted from a variety of directions, including population control programs and US aid assistance to national police and military forces. The Smithsonian Group's recommendations went to the Defense Science Board, which advanced the plan to create a massive database of social information. The information collected by researchers would be incorporated into a large computerized database containing useful information about foreign territories. Soro eventually planned to automate the system for autonomous data analysis and social instability prediction. For 10,000 years, the central question for empires has been how to exploit people without things getting out of hand and leadership being overthrown. The transitions were fluid between the declared intention of the Americans to protect foreign countries from the communists and American ambitions to control client states or even colonies. What is even more devastating is that scientific techniques and computer programs could also be used in the US itself and in Western European countries to manage citizens and protect the upper classes. The director of the Project Camelot, Rex Hopper, had himself predicted the possibility of a revolution in the United States that would result from the emergence of a numerically significant, economically powerful, intellectually informed fringe group. Camelot was seemingly terminated when details became public. Soro changed its name to the Center for Research on Social Systems. Congress reaffirmed the importance of behavioral science research to national security and vowed to maintain funding for these projects. Codenames for the new follow-up projects were, for example, Project Simpatico in Colombia and Operation Task in Peru. The computer program Politica was intended for Chile. At least 40 groups of variables were measured, such as the population's trust in institutions, cultural values, paranoia, hostility towards outsiders, attitudes towards change, etc. The resulting computer simulations were also intended to clarify detailed questions in advance. For example, whether the situation in Chile would be stable if the old ruler Salvador Allende remained alive. The calculations showed that he should die. Many American files on the coup, Operation Fubelt, remained secret, and the Americans naturally wanted to conceal their own role as best as they could, because simple logic and the computer simulations showed that the Chilean population did not like the idea that they were being taken advantage of. The new rule of Augusto Pinochet had to be supported by the CIA through training for secret police and other computer simulations in order to best dose the harsh measures against opposition members and achieve the maximum desired effect. Communist states, on the other hand, persecuted every form of resistance, no matter how small, like the medieval Inquisition, and had no compunction about killing millions of people and putting millions more in labor camps. Accordingly, CIA operatives and American policymakers were willing to use a mix of high-tech and traditional secret police methods to eliminate left-wing rebels in Chile. As the CIA itself admitted in a report published in September 2000, it had maintained close contacts with the Pinochet regime and its secret police, DINA, for many years. Many details are still secret, particularly the CIA's involvement in Operation Condor in the 1970s and 80s, in which 6 right-wing South American governments carried out assassinations around the world. There is still debate today about how many people were murdered or disappeared. The NSA's role in the whole thing is also nebulous. The described torture methods from Chile are the standard program that communists used around the world. As has become known through the testimony of former military personnel, many Argentine disappearances were dropped alive and naked from military aircraft over the open sea after being drugged. Every Wednesday, a plane took off with 10 to 15 prisoners on board. Around 2,000 people are said to have died in 2 years as a result of these death flights.